The topic today is career diplomacy. That's the name of the book. And I don't think that this has ever been really quite such a hot topic as it is today. Um, it's very easy, because I know I fight this, to get caught in the vortex of concern about 30% budget cuts and cuts to the size of our service and the management decisions that seem to make no sense, like slashing eligible family member employment. But there's another side to this, which is that as the Foreign Service has started to become a bit of an endangered institution, it has become possible to every single day in AFSA's Media Digest read articles in major national newspapers that talk about the importance of maintaining career diplomacy, of maintaining a vital foreign service. This is a burgeoning part of AFSA's workload, is trying to actually help make that case with the major media, but I think it's really important. We meet 1 week after what was, for me, one of the most affirming votes I've ever witnessed in the Senate. Last Thursday morning, I was up with at the Senate Appropriations Committee meeting and listened to Republican of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, lay out what was in that SACFO proposed budget. And they talked, the report language calls the 30% proposed cuts reckless and say they amount to a doctrine of retreat. And it says the budget proposal as it was submitted caused confusion and concern in foreign capitals, and that it allowed competitors to, quote, hijack our national security narrative. AFSA has been pushing for a number of months, and I just push it with everybody I get a chance to. 9 in 10 Americans support strong American global leadership. We in the Foreign Service community know that that kind of strong global leadership is unthinkable without a strong professional foreign service deployed around the world, protecting and defending America's people, interests, and values. There is no mandate to pull the Foreign Service team from the field and forfeit the game to our adversaries. And that we're now hearing Congress join in. This is what this language is pretty much repeated in Section 101 of the State Department Authorization Act for 2018 that's been passed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This language appears again in our appropriations bill, which, as Lindsey Graham says, restores funding for personnel at state to levels not lower than we saw in 2016. After he laid that out, they called for a roll call vote, and we went through the drama of watching the only 31-0 vote that day in favor of maintaining the strength of the Foreign Service. There is a moment here where we can double down, triple down, quadruple down on the appreciation in our country for what career diplomacy does to keep us safe and prosperous. So I think this is that moment, and we're trying to throw everything we have at it. These windows open and they close. It's open right now, and we need to run into it with all that we've got. So I use this here to just tell all assembled, we'll be sending out an AFSA net. I think it'll be cleared out by tomorrow, which will go to all members, which is in conversational tones, how to talk to Congress about what bang for the buck you get from the Career Foreign Service, how small we are, how much we deliver, how we're the most cost-effective tool in the National Security Toolkit. So all of you, I'm proselytizing. Today, what's that? Amen. So today we have a very solid twofer team in terms of our authors. We have former Foreign Service officer Harry Kopp and my current AFSA Governing Board colleague and former AFSA President John Naland, now back on the board serving as retiree vice president. They're here to discuss the 3rd edition of the continually popular book, Career Diplomacy: Life and Work in the U.S. Foreign Service, which was recently published by Georgetown University Press. It goes without saying that you should all make sure to buy a copy before you leave. I am so pleased to welcome Harry and John today, and I look forward to the discussion. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Is this, you can hear me? Good. Yeah, this is the 3rd edition of Career Diplomacy. It's the one with the map on the cover. So if you're shopping at Amazon, make sure you get the one with the map and not the ones with the eagles. Those are the 1st and 2nd editions. The 1st edition came out in 2008. It was a project of the Cox Foundation, and the idea for this book originated in a discussion at the policy committee of the Cox Foundation. Uh, a member of that committee was Tony Gillespie, former ambassador to Colombia and Chile, and a friend of mine from the Foreign Service. And he brought me in to help him write this book. Unfortunately, he passed away before the book hit the shelves in 2008, but I want to be sure to mention him and mention his name. He should not be forgotten. We did a second edition in 2011, and this is the third edition here in 2017. Altogether, we probably have sold about 25,000 copies. So it is a text that is well read among people considering a Foreign Service career, aspiring to the service, studying the service academically or interested in it as members of the service, as journalists, as civil servants, people concerned with international affairs generally. There's a lot of stuff in the book. If I can draw on my personal experience, I would say it's a little bit like a Brazilian feijoada or a Polish bigos. It's got, many ingredients that somehow come together to form a coherent and tasty whole. It is descriptive and not prescriptive. We try not to talk about what's wrong and how to fix it, but we talk about how things are. Now, sometimes we give in to the temptation to explain how to fix things, but mostly we resist that. Carrie Cavanaugh, who reviewed the book in this month's edition of the Foreign Service Journal, said this was the best and worst time to publish the book. The best time because it's really important now, as Barbara just said, for people to understand what the Foreign Service is, what it does, and why career professionals are so important to U.S. national security. And the worst time because the manuscript was completed before last year's election. And those of you who have written a book know how much of a lag there is between the manuscript and publication. So our book, for the most part, does not take into account the changes that have taken place since January 20th or that are in train. But this book is not a book about current affairs in any case. It's about career diplomacy, which doesn't change rapidly. We talk about the Foreign Service. I guess we sort of follow the rule of threes, which you may have learned in freshman composition. We talk about the Foreign Service as an institution, a profession, and a career. And we say that the Foreign Service has a triple mission, which is representation, operations, and policy. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these, but I'll try to be real quick and turn things over to John. Foreign Service as an institution. We talk about its history, its traditions, and its culture, and look at the forces that shaped the service. Many of those forces you can see in 19th century American diplomacy. The reliance on patronage, on amateurs who are wealthy and politically connected. That's a 19th century phenomenon that is unfortunately persistent and continues into the present day. The separation of a home service in the Department of State from a foreign service that worked abroad. That was a complete separation in the 19th and much of the 20th century, early 20th century. It has eroded, but there are still, of course, there's still a division between a foreign service and a civil service, with the civil service working domestically and a foreign service spending most of its time overseas. We talk about the three Foreign Service Acts, 1924, 1946, and 1980, and how they have shaped and continue to shape the Foreign Service. And we talk about a very important phenomenon, the mutual mistrust between the career professionals and the political leadership. Uh, Almost every administration, particularly when there's a change of party, comes in concerned that the Foreign Service is not attuned to its objectives and perhaps prepared to sabotage them. And many career diplomats, after an election, think these new guys are fools or knaves, and we've got to be real careful about them. This mistrust, which again goes back a long way, really came to flower, so to speak, during the McCarthy era in the 1950s, late 40s and 50s. And the shock of that period, when career professionals were cowed into self-censorship, that shock has not fully worn off, even 70 years later. The service is a self-governing institution. Members of the service set most of the rules for entry of new people into the service, for promotions, for assignments. That has many advantages because people with experience understand who is best to follow them, and it creates a sense of an institution. But it creates some insularity too, and that's been a problem. It was the Act of 1946 that first said the Foreign Service should be representative of the American people, and that's a command that 75 years later the service is still struggling to carry out. We talk about, as I said, about the Foreign Service or diplomacy as a profession. There's a lot of debate about whether diplomacy is indeed a profession. We say it is. It's an open profession, rather like journalism. Amateurs are welcome to participate. There is no credentialing body. You want to be a diplomat, you only have to be named by a sending state and accredited by a receiving state. You want to be a senior policy official in the United States, only two credentials. One, get yourself nominated by the president. Two, get yourself confirmed by the Senate. No other credentials. Nevertheless, there is a body of knowledge that you need to master if you are going to be an effective diplomat. And there is a code of ethics that you need to follow. There is as we said, a triple mission, and I'll cover that very quickly: representation and operations and policy. By representation, I don't mean what you do with your representation allowance, holding coffees and cocktail parties. I mean conveying U.S. policies and views lucidly and efficiently and effectively and precisely and persuasively to foreign audiences, and reporting useful information that you collect abroad and putting it in some kind of analytic context, negotiating agreements, large agreements and little ones day to day. There's also a kind of unofficial representation that every member of the Foreign Service is engaged in. When you walk down the street in a foreign capital and you are an official representative of the United States government, you are representing the American way of life, the American way of behaving. When you treat people with respect, it's noticed, and if you treat them without respect, it's really noticed. Operations, I mean by that running systems and projects and programs. This is an area of work that is of increasing importance for the Foreign Service. Enforcing and administering U.S. laws, like the Immigration and Nationality Act, the visa provisions, protecting U.S. citizens and property, supporting the U.S. presence overseas, whether it's official or unofficial, running contractors who are increasingly prevalent in the execution of U.S. foreign policy. And who does this operational work? Foreign service specialists, consular personnel, security personnel, people at AID, foreign service members who are engaged in stabilization and reconstruction activities, disaster relief. All of these activities I would classify as operational. They have a lot in common. They all require technical skills and managerial skills. And this is, I say, an area of really rapidly growing importance for the Foreign Service. Policy. National interests are defined by our political process, but it's the Foreign Service that is the repository of American expertise in the most effective ways to advance these national interests. Foreign Service people, and I'm talking here particularly about the senior level, bring something to policy deliberations that is lost when they are not included. They have a knowledge of the motivations and the levers of power in foreign countries. They understand probably better than people outside the service what the range of possibilities might be in any negotiation. They have an ability, or should have an ability, to predict the foreign reactions to changing circumstances. And unique to the service is a sense of what resources in time and money and human capital and physical capital that might be needed to carry out any policy or to execute any strategy. This is rare knowledge that policymakers need to have in order to do their work effectively. The book has sections on serving in combat zones and near combat zones. We talk a lot about the challenges of staying professional in a highly politicized environment. By professional here, we mostly mean staying honest and candid in reporting to your superiors. Working with other agencies gets a chapter. That's a difficult task, especially when other agencies are far better resourced than the Foreign Service agencies. And we talk a great deal about the Foreign Service career. I left the Foreign Service 32 years ago, so my sense of the career is not so good. But John Naland, John was an active officer for how long? 30 years. And left 2 years ago, was twice president of AFSA, has been involved and still is involved with the retirement program. So he's thoroughly up to date, and he'll talk about what we say in the book about the career and the future of the service.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to echo Harry in thanking the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, which supports a strong foreign service. They launched the book and have supported it over the years. I want to thank my esteemed co-author. I basically kind of like renovated the kitchen of this house or added a deck, but he's the one who built the house. So the solid structure is all from him. And I also want to honor Tony Gillespie, because he was actually the ambassador in Bogota, Colombia, when I was a brand new junior officer and went out to post. And he was the consummate U.S. ambassador, and at the time he had $1 million price on his head from the Medellin cartel. So I really want to honor him. Now, these are my views only. They're not of the U.S. government, not of AFSA, and in some cases probably not of my co-author. But I think there's some great value in this book. And again, he wrote a lot of it, but he mentioned the McCarthy era. So we see what's going on in the Trump era. We don't know how long the Trump era will be, but we see what's going on in the Trump era. But if you understand what happened in the McCarthy era, it's not the same thing, but you realize that we've kind of been through things before. This is not our first time at the rodeo. So, and the Nixon era. President Nixon one night at 2 a.m. Called the senior Foreign Service officer in the service and said, "Fire those sons of bitches." And he was talking about a bunch of civil service and foreign service officers who had, protested the planned incursion into Cambodia. So we don't know that President Trump is called over, but a president in the past has. So, and we detail in the book several times the boom and bust cycle in foreign service hiring. And I'll mention a little more of that. So, and diversity. If you don't understand the current concerns about making the Foreign Service more representative of America, you just need to study the history of the women's class action suit and the black officers' class action suit, and understand that as you said, the Foreign Service Act of '46 gave some signals, and the Foreign Service Act of '80 gave some signals, and here 37 years after Foreign Service Act of 1980, we're still working on accomplishing that. So a lot of folks in the Foreign Service don't understand or don't know our own history. My degrees in college were on ancient history and anthropology, so I didn't know anything. So I would just encourage anyone currently in the Foreign Service or interested in joining to know the history of this outfit. And I think some in the Foreign Service don't clearly understand how different the Foreign Service is from other careers, and we discuss this. And of course, I was in the Army. I know there are military veterans here. So I'm not saying the Foreign Service is harder than the military or harder than the intelligence community, but it is a different lifestyle. And when you understand the worldwide availability and the hardship service, the up or out, the mandatory retirement, the pressure on families, then you can understand better why we kind of go so ballistic when someone from outside the service is plunked down into a senior Foreign Service position. So that helps understand where we're coming from on that. The book worked really hard on trying to get accurate statistics, and most of these are unpublished, but if you can phrase the question just rightly to the department, you can get the answers, and I think we accomplished a lot of that. It has the clearest explanation in print I've seen of the Foreign Service hiring process, and even though hiring is very low this year, the process is still there. And it has information on career trajectory. I mean, I've been on several promotion panels. I was an office director in the HR Bureau. So unless you've kind of worked and done some of that, if you're in the Foreign Service, you may not understand some of the nuances of promotions assignments. So I think it's useful in that regard. Now, the future of the Foreign Service. We're in a what now, and it's kind of what the heck now moment. And the book, I think, does a good job of saying again that there are these unfortunate pendulum swings between hiring booms and hiring busts. I mean, as recently as 2010, we brought on board 727 Foreign Service officers. That's just Foreign Service officers. We brought on additional specialists. 2 years ago, we brought on 290, which is about at attrition. And this year, I don't know what the number is. It's probably 120 or something. So there are these boom and bust cycles, and that directly results in gluts and gaps in promotions and assignments. So after the hiring boom, especially under Secretary of State Clinton, we had this thing called the pig and the python. And the python is the promotion, the career chain, the promotions. And the pig was this clump of people that were hired within, a 4-year period, and they're going through. So they saw fast promotions. Well, I don't know what the opposite of having a lot in your stomach is, but whatever, having an empty stomach. Now the empty stomach is going to be going through the python, and promotions are going to be slowed. So I'm not saying that's okay, because the book several times, even though we're not supposed to be prescriptive, it does criticize this boom and bust cycle. But you need to understand kind of we've been to this rodeo before, and so you can just predict the future because we've been there. So in the mid-90s there were low hiring, and then 7 years later, there were these GAO reports and OIG reports saying that, hey, overseas we have junior officers supervising junior officers, and they don't have language proficiency, and it's all because of the low hiring. So mark your calendar, 5 or 6 years from now, you be reading the GAO reports and the OIG reports about, inadequate supervision and accountability and stuff, because, we have to promote people faster than their experience, merits it. Something else the book shows is that, presidents come and go. Now, I'm not saying we're the deep state that's here forever, but presidents, a president's term is going to end, and there'll be a new president, and things will change for the Foreign Service. And the same with the Secretary of State. And I had the honor of being AFSA president under part of Secretary Powell's term, and I had the chore of being the AFSA president some years later under Condoleezza Rice's term. And they were both secretaries of state for the same president, but the experience couldn't have been different, and experience for the Foreign Service. Secretary Powell got this initial hiring boom that unfortunately immediately shipped out to Iraq and Afghanistan, but at least when under his tenure, he dramatically increased the size of the Foreign Service. And Secretary Rice, not so much. So even if, the current president is here for 8 years, if the Secretary of State changes, it could be a different thing. Who knows what Nikki Haley or Dave Petraeus or someone, might do. So we can always hope. There's always hope. So basically, this too shall pass. It may take a while to pass, but this too shall pass. And again, as Harry's already mentioned, it's important to know that the Foreign Service sometimes has had strained relationships with, a President Nixon or a Secretary Rice or something. And those of us who've been through this for a while, there are these cycles. I mean, we were under transformational, and if you're new to this game, you haven't heard these terms, but, for 4 or 5 years, we were under transformational diplomacy. And then we were under diplomacy 3.0. And now we're talking about having the Foreign Service do more to make America first. Well, when Larry Eagleburger was Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State, he's the only Foreign Service officer who's became a Senate-confirmed Secretary of State. When Larry Eagleburger was Deputy Secretary and then Secretary, he instituted this policy of the America's desk. Every country, and this has a desk. The Cuba desk, the Iraq desk, whatever, and every desk officer, was working the America desk, promoting America. And so, we've done this before, and the same thing when transformational diplomacy came about. People would say, well, we've always been doing transformational diplomacy. Anyway, so I don't know what the new, catchphrase will be, but, we'll run with it. And the one, so I've talked about these kind of like the sunspot cycles, in hiring and other things. But there has been a kind of a clear trajectory in the last couple years where the Foreign Service has been losing market share in terms of policy implementation. And the American Academy of Diplomacy had a report, American Diplomacy at Risk, that talks about some of this. And right now, I think we're seeing more of this because the Secretary has cleared out all but one of the career, or all but two of the career Foreign Service officers serving in Assistant Secretary above positions. And, the media now is saying, well, no one's been nominated to fill these positions, and that's very true. But, be careful what you ask for, because we'll wait and see who gets nominated. And if it turns out that of the couple dozen, and of course, that may be cut back, we'll see, Assistant Secretary positions, if none are career Foreign Service officers, then that would be a dramatic development that would be of much concern. So, kind of what can you do? If you're in the Foreign Service or considering joining the Foreign Service now, and I can say this because I'm out, but just keep in mind, and because I was an Army officer, so this resonates with me. Dwight David Eisenhower was a major for 16 years. Now, they didn't have a time and class thing that was going to kick him out like the Foreign Service does. But Eisenhower was a major, which is an FS3 equivalent, for 16 years during the interwar period. And this is World War I to World War II period, because we've had wars since then. So I should specify. And he stuck it out, and you know what? Ended up with 4 stars on both of his shoulders. So yeah, it's not ideal. And and if you're in the Foreign Service right now, and you happen to have just opened your so-called window for promotion to the Senior Foreign Service, or you're nearing the end of your tick, it's not a good time. But if you're not in that position, stick it out, because this too shall pass. For people now in the Foreign Service, this is a good time to fine-tune your language skills, to take training. Most Foreign Service folks have never had any training in negotiations. It's just amazing. And the FSI has a 1-week or a 2-week course. And so if you're Foreign Service and you're stationed here, sign up for it and actually get some training on something that's key to your profession. Do independent reading. If you're going to be sent overseas and they don't have time to send you to the 2-week country orientation, read a book, study up on it. Those of us who've served in war zones with the military have always been impressed that when the military deploy, they've been studying for 9 months. Of course, they, have a training float and all that stuff. So good Foreign Service folks, even if you don't get the training, you can still read up on your own. And then take assignments that expand your horizons. Now, I know the detail assignments have been cut back, but to the extent possible, if we're in a slow time, like when Eisenhower was stuck as a major, take the time to develop yourself. Give back to the community. If you're in the Foreign Service, volunteer to be an AFSA rep, serve on the AFSA governing board, volunteer to serve on a promotion board, serve on the interagency housing committee. And that is someone who's worked a lot. I was the director of the Office of Retirement. If you're in the Foreign Service now and you have any spare time, take some training at the Foreign Service Institute to learn about your retirement benefits, because you need to know and you need to plan ahead. And so I just want to read, I want to read 2 paragraphs in the book, but the introduction of those 2 paragraphs is that the future of the Foreign Service is not in the hands of Trump, Tillerson, the Congress, or of Foreign Service retirees who write books. They're in the hands of current and future Foreign Service members. So the future is yours to do with as you want. If there's a thing in the Washington Post today about Woody Allen. Nowadays, he makes one movie a year, and it's so easy. He goes home at 5 o'clock and he makes a little money and he's happy enough. If that's how the Foreign Service wants to do their career, then fine. But if you want to serve America better, then put some more effort into it. So just to read a couple paragraphs, which ends with a nice quote from Mark Grossman, who, if any of you know anything about the Foreign Service, is one of the best diplomats of his generation. Foreign Service members who believe that career diplomats are the nation's best instrument for conducting foreign policy must prove their case, and prove it every day. They do so with their knowledge of foreign languages and cultures, their sense of history, their range of contacts, their insights as reporters and analysts, their skill as negotiators, their leadership, their wisdom, their courage to work in difficult and dangerous locations, and their ability to win for their country the understanding, respect, and admiration of foreigners. Former Director General Mark Grossman had it right when he said, quote, "The best diplomats are optimists. They believe in the power of ideas. They believe that sustained effort can lead to progress. They believe that diplomacy, backed by the threat of force, can help nations and groups avoid bloodshed, and that the United States has an important and often unique role to play in the modern world." End quote. So that's our book, and we'd be glad to take any questions. Yes, sir.
So if you were in charge of this reorganization of that, what 3 things would you change?
I would blow up state's IT infrastructure and start over somehow. Okay, and I'm not an IT expert, but I work part-time still at state, and I work through by fighting the system. So anyway, the computer system. So, and I don't if the secretary wants to move, consolidate some things, go for it. The president got elected and the secretary was confirmed by the Senate, and let's give it a try. But I think we need to keep career Foreign Service officers and to some extent career civil service officers in the policy formulation, and downsizing just to downsize. ExxonMobil, you downsize and your market share, the stock value might go up, but in the Foreign Service, it doesn't work. And as Ambassador Stevenson said, the Congress is not going to go along with it anyway. So I don't know. I'm not involved in the reorg thing, and I'm glad.
One thing that I've noticed, we don't talk about it much in the book, but the State Department is very top-heavy. We've all read recently about the number of special representatives, special envoys, these store-bought ambassadors. There are 50-something. That's a complicating problem. The number of assistant secretaries or equivalent positions that report, at least theoretically, directly to the secretary, it's enormous. The secretary has a span of control that can't be effectively exercised. We have in state, on a sort of top people to bottom people ratio, we have something like 200 generals for every battalion. And we need to flatten out the structure somehow in the State Department. I'm not close enough to day-to-day events to have any advice at all on how to do that. But there are too many senior positions for the number of people in the department, the number of employees. I don't know quite how to accomplish a flattening out of the structure, but I think the department would be more effective if there were a steeper pyramid. That's, I guess, two things. And you asked for three. But
What's your third?
Well, no, and this one's interesting, though. I mean, we have, I think, as I understand it, we have something like 10% of the senior executive service of the entire U.S. government.
I think that's right.
It's phenomenal. But the issue is that we do that not based on managing. So you're talking about managing the department. So if we were just managing the department, we could flatten it out a lot. But we do that based on expertise. So we're kind of like the equivalent of doctors and lawyers in the Army, where they come in at a higher rank because you want to capture their expertise. So that's the only thing. I mean, the envoys are obvious, but it's also a question of just across the board, do we have too many senior people that could, doing things that could have been done by, as you say, colonels and majors? That's a valid question.
Well, there's also a problem of coordinating with other agencies, which are far larger.
Right.
And we sometimes need to have a person of a certain rank in order to deal effectively with, say, the Treasury, or with DOD. And that's a problem, because we don't have the bottom of the pyramid to support this large top. So it's not a simple issue. If it were, it would have been solved. But I think from a management point of view, it is a problem.
My third thing would be figuring out what we're doing with expeditionary diplomacy, because I think we're still trying to sort that out and to make a decision about, do we want a more expeditionary service? Do we want a service of micro posts, or do we want everybody collected into large embassies? And that, I think, is a valid, you probably write about that in the book, which I'm going to buy today, but that I'm sure is again, looking forward, is one of the things that we still haven't come to terms with. We had a love-hate relationship with this stuff for 10 years, and now we're just hoping it goes away.
We do write about this in the book, and to some extent, the question of whether to engage in expeditionary diplomacy depends on whether there's an expedition that you need to carry out. If we don't have another war like the war in Iraq, if we manage to end the war in Afghanistan and not repeat that sort of adventure, we might find that we have a much diminished need for the kind of diplomacy that we carried out in those two countries. But we need to have, maybe this is the third change, we need to have the flexibility in the service and in the department to respond to dramatic changes in international conditions. Sometimes a foreign service of 15,000 members is large, but sometimes it's way too small. And we don't have now the ability to respond to sudden changes in international conditions with additional personnel or with reductions in personnel. I don't know how to solve that problem either, but it really should be addressed.
Yes.
First, I wonder what factors most changed or that you needed to spend most attention to updating between the last edition and this edition. And two, with regards to representative of America, going back to the 1946 Act, I wonder if that has been defined over time beyond that particular phrase, because if we want to be truly representative, we need to have criminals and all manner of miscreants. And it seems to me that at a definition of what that means is as important, and whether that has emerged over time.
I think in 1946, the concern in the Congress and the public was to move the Foreign Service away from the East Coast and to bring into the service people who were not from the elite universities of the East Coast. The identification of that phrase, representative of the American people, with racial and ethnic minorities and with women came much later. Women were not accepted into the service unless single until the 1970s. And the treatment of women was the product not so much of enlightened leadership as of lawsuits, which the department fought with tenacity and skill and dragged out for more than 2 decades. It created great problems that last today, because the ability of the department and the service to design exams for entry is restricted by court orders that say you must do this, you must not do that, and it's been a real challenge. So there is no definition, or there's a shifting definition. I'm not sure it's an easy thing to define that phrase, representative. The department and the service exist in this, in a general cultural and historical context. And that phrase, representative of the American people, changes as the historical and cultural context changes. So today, it's no business of the department, of the service, what the sexual orientation of an officer might be. But in the 1950s, the suspicion or the association of a member of the service, the suspicion that he might be gay or associates with gay, that was a cause for firing. And indeed, the purges of the McCarthy era fell much more heavily on homosexuals than they did on people of left-wing views. So these phrases have to be read in a historical and cultural context. I don't know quite. I think defining that phrase precisely would be very dangerous.
I mean, that's an important point, because the headline census reports you see will include, green card holders, undocumented aliens, people in prison, and the Foreign Service, at least Foreign Service officers. There's no requirement to have a college degree, but I think 99.999% of Foreign Service officers have college degrees. And of course, we have to be American citizens, and you have to be, between 21 and 59 and a half. So I have seen an internal HR document, and I forget the exact phrase, but it's basically college-educated American citizens, and I think that's as far as it went. Because, you can't count people who are 4 years old, and if there's a greater preponderance of them are minorities, that'll change the statistics. So it changes the percentages just a couple, but it's an important point. In terms of what's changed a lot in the book, the previous book was written at the height of the Iraq War, and there was just a whole lot on that. And even though I was leading a provincial reconstruction team in Iraq at the time the book was being written, when it came to update it, we dialed that way back in hopes that we don't have provincial reconstruction teams in Iran or North Korea at some point, but you never know. So some of that's, we kept, it went from the Foreign Service at War to duty and danger, and it highlights more. And what's really amazing about the AFSA plaques in the over at the main state lobby is that, yeah, there's a number of people from Vietnam, and there's a number of people from Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's amazing that there are like 50 other countries where Foreign Service members have been killed. So there's duty and danger everywhere. So the new book kind of brings that out more. Anyway, questions, more questions? Yes?
Things have been written. Sorry, I'd be interested in how much thinking there's been or items written on the size of the Foreign Service. I know you've sort of referred to it, and the reference sort of goes both ways. We need more people. What does that mean? We need fewer senior people. Well, that's the opposite. That's different from saying we need at least as many senior people as we have and many more people at bottom and mid levels, which is not the way the conversation went. What would it mean? What would it look like to have twice as many career diplomats as we currently have? What does that suggest? What does that let you do or not let you do? And I haven't seen a lot on that, but I may just not be looking in the right places. If I can take one other quick question, my last tour of duty was serving as a POLAD with the Navy. And the one thing, and I'd spent my entire career in Palm Mill issues and had worked with the active duty military, but on my turf, in delegations for many, many years. What shocked me, being the only diplomat in a naval base, was I would say 80%, this is made up figures, of their effort, focus, etc., in terms of identity and energy was Navy first. And Navy includes people in the Navy family, your family's in the Navy, it's a broad definition, but Navy first, 80%. Another 10%, military first. So Navy first, 89, and then that last 10%, the US and the world first. In my experience in the Foreign Service, you wouldn't just reverse those, you'd go 90% American interests, that's what we're about. And almost no one else talks that way in an embassy from different agencies. And then 10%, well, your family, your friends, your mission, maybe 3% the Foreign Service. And I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
Well, I'll take the first one if possible, and then punt to and Secretary Powell talked about this a lot. What the Foreign Service really lacks is a true training float. And so, Secretary Powell said that Foreign Service officers come in better educated than young military officers. But military officers retire better educated than senior Foreign Service officers because military officers have this constant, and you know, I was in the Army and I did the Army War College as a FSO, have this constant training. And so when I was in the War College, there were 18 seminars, but there were FSOs in like 2 of them or something. So if we had a 900 person or whatever it is, and some of the American Academy of Diplomacy reports go into this training float, you know, we could have, you know, Foreign Service members, you know, at all of the war colleges and working in private industry like the military does, and at think tanks as senior fellows. And, you know, the military, at least the Army that I know, you know, after 5 or so years, they figure, okay, you're going to stay in the Army, so we're going to put you through, I think it's a 6-month course, you know, to really teach you, you know, more about this profession that you're going to be advancing in. And State used to have a mid-level course that apparently was horrible, but okay, good. Well, I've always heard it was horrible, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do it, you know. So if you made the Foreign Service, whatever it is, 900 people bigger, and put them more through training throughout their careers, not just, I think that'd be better. And then you need to decide, are we going to be in every country? And I don't know how that's going to come out in the reorganization. But if we're going to have embassies in almost every country, then we need a fairly large Foreign Service to do that. And in terms of, I need to think more about your second point. I mean, I was in the Army, and it was similar to the Navy. I mean, you know, and I was in the cavalry, which is, you know, not just the Army. It's the cavalry, the armored cavalry. You know, so, and that was really in our minds there, and we knew our history, you know, the history of our specific unit, which was U.S. Army's most battle-honored unit. We were not at Little Bighorn, okay? We weren't there, but you know, so there was a lot more of that. But I need to think about it because you know, I'm very comfortable with, you know, putting America first, and the Foreign Service is kind of like the intelligence community, kind of quiet there in the background. But I need to think more about it because there's probably a medium, mid-level, there a happy medium.
Let me just speak to that same point. The Foreign Service does not have much of a sense of itself. Foreign Service officers are not much interested in the service as an institution, a service with a history. You don't sense when you come into the service that there are people who have been there before you and will be there after you're gone. The Foreign Service has never engaged in much pageantry or ceremony. For years there was no sort of retirement ceremony at all, and even now it's ceremony is rarely exercised. There's very little done to build a sense of an institution to which people need to have a passionate loyalty. But Foreign Service officers, the ones that I knew when I was on active duty and the ones I've known since, they're all of them patriots. And they have a deep love of the United States, a deep love of the country that they serve. It's quiet. It's sort of bad form to express it in a noisy way. But when the flag goes up in the morning, or when the Marines lower the flag in the evening, people notice. They stand still. You feel that tug. It's very much there. That's what people are thinking about overseas. They're thinking about, about country. They think about home. They don't think about the service or the institution. That's maybe that's not entirely a bad thing.
I think the military term for officers is professional education. It's long-term, it's purposeful, and you get a lot of that sense of we-ness, institution, profession, and professionalism out of an educational and professional formation process that I would suggest is distinct from training. As a wag once said, you want your daughter to be educated in sex, but not trained. And there is the Foreign Service emphasis on training, I think, has been at the expense, and in part because of the lack of the training, so-called training float. I would call it an education float, so that you could embrace both, because training is a subset of education.
The foreign service training is, in terms of the amount of time that foreign service people spend in training, is very much language training. There's everything else is really catch as catch can. That probably has some effect on this sense of the absence of a sense of cohesion. We don't wear uniforms, you know. We're sloppy. We're independent thinkers. That may be. One of the reasons that in our book we talk about representation, operations, and policy is to get away from the idea of 5 cones, although we talk about that as well, of course. But the skills of the Foreign Service aren't necessarily best considered as politics, economics, public diplomacy, management, and consular affairs.
Yes.
I had a question about promotion in the Foreign Service. So it seems like when I've talked to different Foreign Service officers who come into the Foreign Service as like a second career, maybe like they've worked 10 to 15 years in the private sector, that the Foreign Service does value that experience, but not to the same extent as like previous Foreign Service experience. So like they won't come in at the same level as someone obviously who came out of undergrad, but at the same time, they might not necessarily get by the end of their career to the senior Foreign Service or to higher up positions. Does that make sense to you, the way they value like previous experience, or do you think that like kind of dissuades people from coming into the Foreign Service because if they don't necessarily want to do their entire career here, but they still want to get to like a higher up level?
Yeah, there are very few other professions that are diplomacy. Mm-hmm. So if you were, a partner at a law firm making, this will show how ignorant I am, $200,000, which is, you probably make a lot more, and you come into the Foreign Service, the highest they're going to put you is an FS4, and you'll be making, I don't know what it is, 56,000 or whatever it is. So 85? Okay, that's how long. Okay, well, that's not too bad. But, so I guess if you work for the Gates Foundation, which has a lot of money and goes around the world and basically does diplomacy, then maybe you have something vaguely comparable. But other than that, you don't. So no matter what you did on the outside, you are coming in and you're starting, new in a new profession.
Would the military honor that and recognize it and let you come in as a major?
Yeah, so the military. So, but once you get in, people can move up quickly if you check the right boxes, and that's something else to note about the Foreign Service career. Now there are a number of boxes you have to check to be eligible for promotion to the Senior Foreign Service. The days of being Western European available only are over. You are going to have to do that hardship tour, and state has proposals to tighten that even more. So it is possible to move up quickly. The high risers can make it to the Senior Foreign Service, and this sounds like a long time, 20 years or 15, 16 years. Non-high risers,
Depending on the pig and the python.
right. Non-high risers like me, who are troublemakers, not so much. But we have, some people can make it in 15, 16 years, and often, well, like anything, they take the tough jobs and they do well in them, or evaluated as doing well in them. So you got to take the tough jobs.
Yeah, the Foreign Service is a flow-through system where everyone comes in at the bottom and hopefully leaves at the top. There's very little accommodation for those who ought to come in by their qualifications somewhere above the bottom. It's possible. There's authorization in the Foreign Service Act for these mid-level entries. But for a lot of reasons, the department rarely exercises that authority. And the American Foreign Service Association, in whose quarters we sit, firmly opposed to this mid-level hiring. So it's not easy to take into account experience that people have before they join the service. It can show up indeed in rapid promotion, however, if you have the language skills and some of the other skills.
I just want to add that the Foreign Service really is viewed as a career. I mean, people say, you know, there was this War for Talent report 20 years ago that said, you know, young people nowadays are not going to stay in the Foreign Service a long time. They just want to come in and do it and move on. Well, it didn't turn out. Once you get in, if you get tenured, you're a lifer. So it is a career. So if you, it's very low. It's in the book. It's very low. Now, you know, and in the civil service, you know, the State Department has a large number of foreign affairs officers who are civil service positions, and there's a great turnover there because they come in, they do state, you know, for a while, and then they go to another agency or the private sector or something. But that's not the paradigm of the Foreign Service. So,
Please.
The world is a dangerous place. You mentioned before, thank you, that we need flexibility in hiring. When we have a crisis, we need to be able to expand our ranks and scale down when hopefully a crisis is taken care of, etc. How would you discuss, what do you think about how we need to tweak or change our approach to recruiting? And I would like to add to that one particular element, the element of worldwide availability. You just used an expression which I hadn't heard before, the being lifelong available for a Europe assignment, something like that. I'm currently a career development officer working with new hires. And I have to say, I am quite stunned to see the absence of the word service when I ask people when they come in next week, a new bunch coming in, why they joined the Foreign Service. And there are a million reasons why people join. They're all valuable. But in this changing world where where the number of assignments and hardship and danger post has really increased, we need to really recruit people that take this very seriously. What is your suggestion? How can everybody signs up and signs on the dotted line for worldwide availability, but in reality what we see, it's really not taken very seriously or very literally.
It may not be taken seriously by an entering Foreign Service member, but it must be taken seriously by management. And then you'll find out very quickly, I would think, whether the new entrants have the discipline to make a career out of it. It's up to management to enforce worldwide availability. It's really not up to the employees to decide, I don't think I want to go to Mauritania. You ought not to have that choice, and management should make it clear that choice is your choice is very limited in that area. The other issue, the issue of flexibility, this is not one that we discuss in the book, and it's a really tricky problem that in the past was solved by bringing in large numbers of people on limited appointment, time-limited appointment. That authority still exists and is rarely used, but it might be revived over AFSA's opposition. John will disagree with me about this.
I mean, hopefully when those officers get to post, and hopefully you'll send them to, the best posts are the most challenging posts, the hardship posts. So hopefully you'll send them to a challenging post, hopefully with a good leadership at post, and that's a lot of hopefuls in there. Hopefully they'll get with the program, and if they don't, then hopefully they'll make the mature decision to go do something else. Now, on the State Department's recruiting website, they have a really excellent kind of 20-question questionnaire that, would you be willing to go to a hardship play? And it's really pretty good. So if you click yes, 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 but you don't mean it, then you're taking a position in the Foreign Service from someone else, and you're not going to have a good time. So hopefully you'll send them to somewhere challenging, and they'll get with the program. But, I mean, if this is going to be something that's kind of a generational change, then that would be of great concern. Questions? Comments?
Hi. Just as an undergraduate intern currently working in the State Department, do you have any advice for someone interested potentially working with the Foreign Service? Like what path to take as a undergrad who still hasn't gone to grad school yet or anything? Like what kind of advice do you have for someone interested in potentially pursuing a career in the Foreign Service? I know it's probably in the book, but
That's it. That's it.
but anyway, thank you.
Well, I mean, anyone can join the Foreign Service. It's really amazing. If you can pass the test, you can get in. So there's no one path. You don't have to go to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service or whatever. There's no one path. I mean, obviously, basically everyone who gets in is well read. Read The Economist and The Washington Post and throw in whatever, Wall Street Journal, whatever. And there are all kinds of our book talks about the test, but there's some other, the State Department has online test prep information that tells you the kind of things you're going to want to know about, micro and macroeconomics and history and politics and stuff. But there's no one path. So, and the test, the series of exams are totally imperfect. They've spent, the department spent, lots of money trying to make them better and better and better, but it's an imperfect thing. So some outstanding people don't get through that filter, and it's an imperfect world. So keep trying and have a plan B, because if we're hiring 727 one year, you might get in, but if we're hiring 125, you might not. So, but we need good people. The next generation of Foreign Service members, we need to have them come in. So keep trying.
You said you were an intern at the State Department. Well, you were doing exactly the right thing. You're finding out through your own experience whether international affairs is a career that will interest you, and whether foreign service, I mean that with the small letters, not caps, whether serving abroad is something you want to devote years of your life to. And that's not always easy to figure out, what you really want to do. And you're doing exactly what you need to do to figure this out. And if after serving as an intern in the State Department, you say, yes, this suits me and I'm suited to it, then you'll go ahead and follow the procedures. The State Department website, careers.state.gov, is really very good on this.
Serving overseas is much funner than working in that building. So.
That's also true. That's also true. The real foreign service is indeed overseas. And the smaller more difficult posts are the ones where people are happiest. The places that are a little bit challenging, that's where people become tight knit, where you establish friendships that last throughout your life, and where you feel this great sense of reward and accomplishment at the end of each day.
Anything else? Thank you all for coming.